Welcome to the Grand Theft World podcast, hosted and sponsored by GrandTheftWorld.com. It's episode 109. It's December 4th, 2022. We're coming at you this week with 6 or 7 hours of hardcore news rammed up against the historical context, the documents, the artifacts, the things you might not have gotten a chance to read. And we're going to look at stories like
50 former national intelligence folks who said that what he's accusing me of is a Russian plan. They have said that this has all the five former heads of the CIA, both parties, say what he's saying is a bunch of garbage.
This is classic Trump. We have 4 days left, and all of a sudden there's a laptop. There's overwhelming evidence that from the intelligence community that the Russians are engaged.
I still think that the stories from the fall about your son Hunter were Russian disinformation and a smear campaign, like you said.
Yes. I know you'd ask it. I have no response. It's another smear campaign. It's a last-ditch effort in this desperate campaign to smear me and my family. The vast majority of the intelligence people have come out and said there's no basis at all.
Elon released the Twitter files. It goes on forever. Or as we fondly call them, the Vijaya Monologues, because there's a lot of Vijaya Gotti's texts and communications that kind of contradict what she had told everybody on the Joe Rogan Experience a couple years ago with Tim Pool, where she defended Twitter's policies and so on and so forth. Find out Jack Dorsey, not so much in control, he had to rein her in. He was having trouble.
By opening the floodgates to unfettered free speech, Elon Musk has allowed hate to spread far and fast on Twitter.
While the left whines out another distraction about Matt Taibbi catering to the richest man in the world, what do the Twitter files reveal about the inner workings of, as Taibbi described, a Frankensteinian tale of a human-built mechanism grown out of the control of its designer? By 2020, requests from the New World Order disciples to delete tweets were routine. One executive would write to another, more to review from the Biden team. The reply would come back, handled. Twitter was acting as a wrecking ball of political tech censorship, catering to the corrupt Washington establishment, directly impacting and propagandizing a digital town square which affected the general welfare of the United States, whose lifeblood is protected by the power and freedom of the First Amendment.
And if it turns out there are a lot of us on this list where the DNC targeted us, and I will quote the immortal words of Joseph Welch when he attacked Joe McCarthy for the enemies list he had, "At long last, sir, have you no shame?"
Yes.
President Biden, all of your stocky little operatives in the DNC who have targeted American citizens, have you, Mr. President, have all of you at last no shame?
Taibbi points out that both parties had access to these tools. For instance, in 2020, requests from both the Trump White House and the Biden campaign were received and honored. But the overwhelming amount of leftist Marxist cucks staffed at Twitter ensured that Democrat Party requests took the front burner, a fact backed up by the overall donations by Twitter to the Democrat Party reaching 99.73%, or $165,969 to Democrats, while $451 went to Republicans in 2022.
Are you worried about these Twitter files coming out? And what was that experience like having Kellyanne, who's always in control of herself, sicking this MAGA trolls on you?
It's terrifying. When you get targeted in some of these ways, it's hard to differentiate between what is somebody just online trying to rattle you and what's a real threat. You see in things like Pizzagate that online conspiracies can mobilize very real and very direct offline violence. I saw those harms, I experienced those harms, and now it was those harms through a mainstream news outlet being held up in the Oval Office by the former president of the United States, and that is deeply terrifying.
What does appear to be illegal to the point of treason is that a false narrative of possible foreign hacks supposedly behind the Biden laptop debacle was manufactured by Silicon Valley, the media, and the DNC.
Well, we know that this whole smear on Joe Biden comes from the Kremlin.
That's been clear for well over a year now that they've been pushing this false narrative about the vice president and his son.
According to internal emails, there was zero evidence of foreign interference occurring. What did occur was a meltdown of internal Twitter censorship spearheaded by top Twitter management, with the result of ultimately burying a critical story under false pretenses in order to sway popular opinion and alter the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. In retrospect, we now know that, as the New York Post reported, nearly 4 of 5 Americans who've been following the Hunter Biden laptop scandal 1% said U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland should investigate the laptop. Not only have Twitter employees like Head of Legal, Policy and Trust Vijaya Gotti and Trust and Safety Chief Yoel Roth proven that they willingly altered the 2020 U.S. presidential election, but they have demonstrated that Silicon Valley, the Mockingbird media, and the corruption in Washington is an occupying force and a direct threat to the stability and the future of the United States of America.
This cyber insurrection is what I'm calling it, is an assault on this country, and it's borderline treason if you think about what the executives did at Twitter.
John Bound reporting.
Controlling what we can say is a means of controlling what we think. Anyone who doesn't understand the importance of protecting all speech, including speech we find reprehensible, is an enemy of America.
Do you think that users have a right to freedom of speech, even if what they're saying is wrong or offensive?
I think that one human being should not decide how millions of people communicate with each other. One human being should not be able to go into a dark room by himself and decide, oh, that person gets heard from, that person doesn't. That's not how it should work.
It says Twitter provides a global communication platform which encompasses a variety of users with different voices, ideas, and perspectives. As a policy, we do not mediate content or intervene in disputes between users. This is all just the First Amendment law. And they say down here, if you believe content or behavior you're reporting is prohibited in your local jurisdiction, please contact your local authorities. This is the sleight of hand that the establishment has done, is they've equated free speech with hate speech. So if you're for free speech, you're against minority groups, because then people will be able to hurl hate speech at them. And so you should be against free speech because it hurts minority groups. The only thing minority groups have is their speech.
So there's a whole lot of things being disclosed. There's a couple other good leaks this week too, so we'll get to that in a second. China is having huge lockdowns. They're building camps for their people. It's really a foreshadowing of what they have in plan for the Western nations. Klaus Schwab et al. Of his World Economic Forum cronies have indicated that China is the model. Bill Gates has said he thought China did a really great job. So if you don't want that type of foreshadowing on your future, we're going to have to take a closer look at what's going on with these COVID policies, these vaccine mandates, all these sort of things that are still going on behind the scenes while you're not paying attention, while you're focused on end of year activities. They're focused on next year lockdowns and mandates and passports and things like that.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to the weekly roundup, where we discuss just a fraction of all the insanity that's taken place in the world this week. Our top story today: mass protests continue to break out in China over the communist government's zero COVID policy. The protests were triggered by a deadly fire in Urumqi, the capital of the far western region of Xinjiang. The blaze killed at least 10 people and injured 9 in an apartment building, leading to public fury after videos of the incident appeared to show lockdown measures had delayed firefighters from reaching the victims. The city had been under lockdown for more than 100 days, with residents unable to leave the region and many forced to stay home. And by forced to stay home, they mean literally trapped in their homes after authorities welded the front door shut. I guess nobody has blood on their hands for this one.
Absolute bedlam in China, where anti-lockdown protests are sweeping the country. Up to 40 people burned to death in an apartment fire in Xinjiang because they were locked inside the building as a result of government-imposed lockdown restrictions. Some are calling it the biggest uprising since Tiananmen Square. The normally compliant Chinese are calling for President Xi Jinping to stand down.
Xi Jinping! Xi Jinping! Xi Jinping! Xi Jinping!
I've lived in China for 30 years. I've never seen such a brazenly open and sustained expression of rage against the PRC government. WeChat is exploding with protest videos and furious vitriol. Civil disobedience is becoming rampant. This is a serious test of CCP governance. The government has drastically underestimated feelings of rage and pent-up anger that the apartment fire has unleashed among the citizenry. Some were even heard to chant, "Give me liberty or give me death." Others chanted, "I don't want a COVID test, I want freedom." Meanwhile, large quarantine camps are still being constructed across the nation. China is still pursuing the disastrous policy of zero COVID. And we here in the West would be in the same mess they are right now if we had not debunked the insane, paranoid, draconian policies that were imposed upon us across 2020 and 2021. But what's particularly odious is the same media outlets that vilified, monstered, dehumanized anti-lockdown protesters in the West, called them granny killers, lobbied for them to be persecuted, locked up, are now praising the Chinese protesters as valiant freedom fighters. No, you don't get to pretend that the last 2.5 friggin' years didn't happen. Sky News, remarkable bravery. Anti-lockdown protesters returned to same spot in Shanghai after being pepper sprayed by police. How did Sky News characterize anti-lockdown protests in the UK? They dehumanized them by pejoratively describing them as unhinged conspiracy theorists, then published detailed investigations accusing them of doing it for the money and spreading harmful misinformation, effectively calling for the government and big tech to ban them from organising. Now that lockdown has been exposed as the outrage that it truly was, these legacy media outlets are now throwing their support behind the Chinese protesters. No, you don't get to pretend that you were on the right side of history when you directly facilitated what was subsequently revealed to be totalitarian methods of mind control, to force the public into accepting lockdown without a whimper of dissent. But it gets worse. The Washington Post's Taylor Lorenz reacted to the unrest in China, not by praising the courageous protesters, but by running defense for the Chinese Communist Party's brutal human rights violations, and clinging on to the fever dream that is long COVID. Despite everything we've learned over the last 2 years, these authoritarians are so demented by their lust for control over the behaviour of other people, they'd still have us under lockdown to this day if they had their way.
Do you support the Chinese people's right to protest? Do you think it's problematic to do business with the Communist Chinese Party when they suppress human rights?
We're also going to get into the fact that Elon had this mass amnesty. There's a lot of people back on Twitter now, such as James O'Keefe from Project Veritas. James O'Keefe from Project Veritas, he's got 1 million followers on Twitter. He's now back. They have a new whistleblower from inside the government that shows that the Biden administration has been participating in human trafficking. And no, this does not tie to the Hunter Biden story and any human trafficking that might be going on with that. This has to do with the border. This has to do with unfair, unhumanitarian treatment of human beings because of policies. And we're going to dig into that.
Como no tenemos para trabajar ilegal aquí. Claro. ¿Quién te dio, cómo conseguiste los papeles? Un papelito que se saca como para aplicar los trabajos. Sí, sí, sí. Tienes que tener un seguro social, ¿no? Ajá, sí, el seguro social. Ajá, ¿y cómo lo conseguiste? Se le llama a una persona y él lo viene a la casa. ¿Y cuánto cobró? 150.
Anyone who is recruiting and transporting minors for the purpose of labor, that is trafficking. That is a federal offense.
Our undercover journalists traveled to Florida. There, they met 20-year-old Frander, who admitted to paying for his sponsor.
$50,000 pagar a migración y otros $3,000 aquí la recibida.
And never having lived at his sponsor's address.
Diste una dirección, pero nunca fuiste a esa dirección. No fui a esa dirección. Ni fuiste con él nunca, con Gregorio. A su casa no.
We met a 15-year-old girl in Houston who told us she had to drop out of school to work long hours in a restaurant kitchen because she owes money to the cartels.
Meses y después te saliste. Sí. Porque tuviste que pagar tu deuda, ¿no? Pero ¿de qué hora a qué hora trabajas?
A las 4. Me entra
Who was recruiting the children? How many were in this particular ring? So sometimes it requires a lot of investigations. So if it's labor trafficking, they would be following those vans to where they were taking the children to work.
So in other words, Project Veritas probably has to go out and do the HHS, Office of the Inspector General's job for them.
¿Y estás trabajando también? ¿Y dónde trabajas? Ah, donde te lleven, wow. ¿Y cuánto tiempo tienes de estar aquí?
Allowing these kinds of businesses to thrive because of this labor trafficking, it's cruel and exploitative, and it's creating conditions really of slavery again in our country.
I don't understand why anybody would want to move a child quickly as opposed to vetting that the place that the child is going is safe.
We've got some smoking gun Fauci emails to look at. Now, last year there was some leaked emails. There were some FOIA request emails. A lot of it was redacted, though. This year, we get to see what's behind all those black pages. There's a lot of the names are unredacted, the content's unredacted. You can see up front, there was not a forthright effort to identify the origin as wet market or lab, and that they were, don't look at the lab, don't look at the lab the whole time. Wouldn't you think if the world was really under threat that you'd look at the lab just in case that's where the answer is? So these people had a predetermined outcome from the get-go, much like Philip Zelikow coming to the 9/11 commission meetings with an outline of how the commission's going to research and what they're going to find ahead of time.
Today, we're going to look at this new trove of Fauci emails. Many of these I only saw in redacted form. Now, thanks to a long FOIA fight from Jimmy Tobias down there at James C. Tobias on Twitter, I just received a bunch of new unredacted emails. He writes detailing the February 1st, 2020 teleconference between Dr. Fauci and virologists discussing SARS-CoV-2. So the time frame in question we want to look at is between January 31st and February 9th, 2020. Okay. And so these are some of the things that we saw back then, right? Remember, this is a famous email from Christian Anderson on January 31st, 2020. Remember, very early on in this pandemic, kicking it out to Tony Fauci, saying, "Hi, Tony." So obviously very familiar with each other. He said, in yellow, "The unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome, less than 0.1%, which is an irrelevant number, by the way. So one has to look really closely at all the sequences to see that some of the features potentially look engineered." So that's what you see when you take a first glance at this virus. That's what I saw. That's what we all saw. And we're going to take a closer look at that because it's really important. He's not wrong. But that was where he was on January 31st. We are going to see that in just 4 days, Christian Anderson completely flipped his story and without a shred of intervening data. So let's look at this, or at least not conclusive data. Let me put it that way. And he writes down further, Eddie, Bob, Mike, myself, all find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. Fancy way of saying, this thing doesn't look like it came from nature. And it really doesn't. We all know that now. So, by the way, at the time, this is what I was working with when I was like decoding all of that for you all back in 2021. We're going to cover this one, which is the smoking gun email. This is it. It's from Jeremy Farrar. Notice we got an attention here to Anthony Fauci. What happened here? What does he say? He says, "Thank you everyone for joining. There is clearly much to understand in this. This call was very helpful to hear some of our current understanding and the many gaps in our knowledge." And this was all redacted at the time I got it in 2021. Now it's unredacted. Thank you to everyone for joining. That part in yellow I just read because that was the beginning of the email, and everything that's below that yellow part was redacted. He writes here, "I do not believe this is a question of binary outcome. It's more a question of what are the evolutionary origins of 2019 nCoV important for future risk assessment and understanding of animal-human coronaviruses." You know what? That's okay. There's still obviously some gray zone. They're not really sure. Jeremy is at least saying, you know, what would be really cool is if we could figure out where this came from, that will help us make it not happen again, obviously, right? But he's writing it very diplomatically, which is like, look, if this came out of a lab, maybe we should know that so we could stop this from happening again. He writes, I do know that there are papers being prepared. There will be media interest, and there is already chat on Twitter and WeChat. In green, we on this call are not the only ones with scientific expertise in this area. And this was an ad hoc group that came together to air some thoughts. It's clearly not the sole group to take this forward. That will need a broader range of input and a respected international body to ask an expert group to explore this with a completely open mind in order to stay ahead of conspiracy theories and social media. I do think there's an urgency for a body to convene such a group. So, what's happening here? So, hey, it's just an ad hoc group. After this was over, all the statements said, experts agree. All the top leading virologists were consulted. I can show you that these virologists are not the leading ones in this particular field. In fact, notably, the actual people I would have had on this if I was at all concerned on these con calls, if I was at all concerned with finding out how this coronavirus came out, are missing from these. So investigative journalism and looking into things and reporting like I do from time to time is both a question of what's there and what's not there. The negative space sometimes tells you more than the positive space. So, but they said, hey, he's like Jeremy saying, well, we may not know everything, and we've convened just an ad hoc group. It isn't necessarily consensus. It isn't necessarily all the experts, although it was presented like that after the fact.
So we're going to look into stories like that. And last but not least, there were some words said that were heard around the world this past week. On a Thursday afternoon, 40 million plus people tuned into InfoWars to see something they'd never thought they'd see on InfoWars or even in real life. It was hardly the strangest interactivity. I mean, if they were all on LSD, it might have been stranger, but it was like one of those things that's a real anomaly in the schedule for the week. A lot of things were said, a lot of contradictions were laid out that don't make any sense. And I don't think the people complaining about the meeting, many, many millions of them, I don't think they took the time to study what's going on there.
During Kanye West's appearance on the Alex Jones show, he praised Hitler while reading the Bible. He spoke about Zionists, but failed to mention how they worked hand in hand with the Nazis to create Israel. He spoke out against porn, but begged God to allow him his supermodel habit. And the entire time, he wore a Balenciaga-styled BDSM mask without ever mentioning his close relationship with them. It was the epitome of cognitive dissonance. And as the political right praise Kanye as a Christian, the political left attack him as a racist, both sides dancing together in gay fascination with the celebrity. This is also called idol worship, and humans have a weak spot for it, although few will ever admit it.
Bring in the clowns. There will be clowns.
So there are some things of concern in there. I saw Mr. Jones get very uncomfortable at the desk several times during that interview, but hooray for free speech, for being able to say, let's have some ideas discussed, and those ideas, though incendiary as they might be and not as eloquently articulated as they could have been, I think it was a winning day for free speech. I don't agree with hardly anything the man known as Ye said, but I do agree with his right to be able to say things that I disagree with. I'm not looking to see people banned or censored, because I think that is the ultimate form of weakness. To learn more about that China situation, let's kick off this episode with Luke Radowski from wearechange.org. He has a little snippet at the beginning of his report from earlier today. Let's get to that, and then we'll get to the rest of this stuff. Hang in there.
Yeah. No, I mean, frankly, the risk of something bad happening to me, of even literally being shot, is quite significant. I'm definitely not going to be, doing any open air car parades. Let me put it that way. But it's also it's not that hard to kill me if somebody wanted to. So hopefully they don't. And if fate smiles upon the situation with me and does not, security. That does not happen. I'm taking reasonable precautions, I guess. But there's definitely some risk here. But
wow, yep, that right there is one of the world's richest people who is now pissing off a lot of other very rich people, telling everyone that his security is at risk here, which it is.
What makes the Grand Theft World podcast unique, invigorating, exciting, and informative? Most other podcasts out there are either doing straight up interviews or they're just covering the daily news. They're covering current events from the day they happen. And that is effective. It's useful. It's a great starting point. And then sometimes these current events change during the week past the first story. So we like to give it a little time. You have to wait till some of the dust settles on these stories in order to give them accurate coverage. And the other thing that's really missing in the media landscape is covering the articles that are coming out every day. That's great. That's necessary. But who's bringing in contextual history so that you can understand what has been going on for decades and decades to lead up to the machinations and actions that we see unfolding today? So what we do here on the podcast is we cover current events. Many of these things are censored, but we wait about a week. As a forensic historian, I focused mainly through my career on the history of globalism and collectivism and things that they call maybe the New World Order. There's a lot of facts to these sort of circumstances, groups, events, activities, working groups that they've had over time. So for Grand Theft World listeners, we not only break down the current events, most of which that are censored during the week, we provide you with contextual history, we give you the source notes, the references, we do deep dives, and this really empowers you with an understanding of context and history so that you can make more informed decisions in your life. There's also a community, a membership where you guys can actually ask questions. We can get into the show, we can share evidence. And there's a town hall weekly for Grand Theft World for those who listen to it and are interested in covering the stories that we don't get to during a 6-hour show. Listening to it an hour a day, you could easily consume the week's news, but you're going to have substance and meaning and context and understanding. And with that, you can make higher quality decisions in your life. So if you're interested in more quality in your life, go to grandtheftworld.com, click podcast at the top, and we'll see you there. Thank you.
These allegations are false.
This isn't Grand Theft Auto, folks. This isn't a video game.
What are the most surprising things that you discovered once you started pulling on that thread? Who he was connected to, what institutions he was influential over, what events he participated in?
Come on, man. What are we talking about? Come on, man. No.
You don't have to think about it, dude.
I got this quote because you said you didn't know much about Klaus Schwab. I made it my job to, as soon as this happened, I'm like, okay, this guy's their front man. Let me learn about the official history of the World Economic Forum. I got their 40-year history. I got every book that Klaus Schwab has written or ghostwritten. I went through those books. This is one of the most interesting passages.
Come on, man. Come on.